If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What is the creepiest thing you have seen/experienced out in the wild? I used to go hiking up the Glen, that's what we call a big mountainous valley in Scotland, when I was younger, because we lived in the country. I frequently hiked through dense forestry areas. Lines of pine trees had been grown. It's naturally very easy to get lost in this sort of forest due to everything looking the same. Anyway, one day I found a black bag with a bunch of women's clothes in it. It looked like that they had been there for a while. The creepiest part was a pair of broken heels. After this I started finding individual shoes, usually heels, half buried in the forest floor. I never thought anything of it at the time, but this was a very secluded area. Friend of mine and his fiancée were hiking in Washington state. He usually takes a logging road as far into the wilderness he can go, then hike for a few days. Usually, he's gone for a week or so and comes back to tell us about his trip. Well, they go out and within 2 to 3 days they're back. He says he was easily 10 miles or so into the wilderness, when his girl needed to pee as they were hiking. She goes over to a less brushy area while he walks around a bit. When he looks back to her, there's a guy with no shirt on, about 30 feet away watching her. The guy isn't wearing a shirt, has brown canvas type pants and very old working boots. He looks older, in his 40s or so, and like he's been living in the woods for years. The guy doesn't notice him, but doesn't really do anything other than just stand behind a tree and peek out now and then. He walks over to his fiancée and just says, "Don't look around, don't ask questions. We need to leave right now." My buddy has been hiking for over 30 years, Washington state for the last 20 years easy, he's experienced. He's also armed with a .40 caliber that he has in his backpack. It took them all day and into the night to get back to his truck. He says they were never followed. The thing is, even way out in a very remote area, you never know. We had a big loud ass party until 1 in the morning. I was thinking he heard someone stumble in a drunk stupor or something like that. Then I heard it too. The call of a loon. The bird. Not an idiot loon. So I laughed and called him a loon too and told him to go to sleep. Nope, he said. That didn't freak him out. So I waited again. All of a sudden we hear this ungodly screaming. Nothing animal-like, and it didn't take long. Followed up by a really loud moaning sound. I mean loud. It even woke the rest of us up. By this point it freaked even me. Safe to say nobody ended up sleeping that night or the next night. We just there in the dark waiting for whatever it was. We asked one of the people who organized the event if they heard anything. They heard it too and it freaked them out too. Still have no idea what it was, and I will not be visiting this place anymore. I was camping alone one time and had just had a bunch of coyotes pass me in the night, howling and making a ruckus. So I'm lying there awake in my tent, and I hear something, sounds like a branch breaking. No big deal, right? Sounded like a big branch though. Then another, and then another, like something is walking around me, something big. I'm in a big circular field and the noise is coming from the tree line. It proceeds to make this noise once every 10 seconds or so, and does a complete circle around the field I was camping in. At that point I had gotten out of my tent because I was freaked out. I start saying things like, "Hey, if someone's there, come out." No answer, just more of the noise. It finally fades off into the direction I first heard the noise, and that was that. The next morning I checked for prints in the mud, thinking it was a feral hog or something else, never found anything. I was camping on land my family owns in Texas. I spent every weekend there as a kid, and throughout my teens, I'd been camping 100 times and heard coyotes while camping 99 times. I've never figured out what that noise could have been. Still gives me goosebumps. My husband, kid, and I live out in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres. I'd say probably 95 of those acres are wilderness with ATV and hiking trails that we, and several of the previous owners, created by exploring. We use that land for camping, hiking, and hunting. We like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There's so much space we've never stayed in the same place twice. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh. Lots of animal tracks, places where deer bed down, etc. I've even spent a lot of time hiking solo while the kid is in school and husband's at work. Whether alone or with the family, we always carry a firearm for protection. A few weeks ago, we decided to load up our camping gear and start a new trail. We mark the trails we make with spray paint on trees. We were pretty far in the woods, having hiked almost an hour when the atmosphere seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, the insects were quiet. There were no sounds around us. When in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onward, hyper aware of our surrounds while our kid continued merrily talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property. We stopped for a few minutes, my husband and I in a stare down with each other. We both felt something was off but didn't want to scare our daughter. I finally broke the silence and said I suddenly didn't feel good and that we should go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest. "Too bad, kiddo." We turned around and started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in silent wilderness, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off our trail. I'm positive they saw that I noticed them but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention and when he looked back, I put my hand on the gun in the holster on my hip which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation of anything. I sped up my family and we hurried back home. I told my husband as soon as we were inside. We decided to call the police and report the trespasser. Filed a report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week, then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cams we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit in 2 images. We handed copies over to the cops to go with our report. We haven't gone back out since except to check the deer cams. Haven't gotten any other trespassers. It freaks me out even more to think of the few times, while camping, that we heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night. We always assumed it was curious animals but now I'm not so sure. I was doing some backcountry snowshoeing. Had a week off so I thought I'd spend it freezing my ass off miles from anywhere or anyone. I got to base camp which was basically just a parking lot, emergency phone, a posted map of the area, and a bunch of signs emergency rescue may be unavailable. Local frequency is 9,999. All that stuff. You're very alone in the backcountry. I only saw 3 people the whole time. The first guy was at base camp, but we set off in different directions. First few hours were pretty typical. Just a lot of nature and quiet, with the only sound being your own footsteps. I end up following a game trail through some woods. It started snowing and visibility got to be not so great. It did make for some fantastic pictures though. Then the snow got worse. Not to the point I needed to stop, but it was pretty borderline. If I hadn't been in the woods the wind might have been too much. I see some movement up ahead. Something else on the trail, and moving towards me. Pretty soon I can tell it's a man. We reach each other and stop to chat. Stopping to talk to someone is generally a really good thing to do out in the wilderness. For one, it's a break from the monotony of your own footsteps, and it might save your or their life if you're able to give rescue crews a more recent position. So it's pretty much standard practice to stop and chat for a little bit. This guy is maybe 50, in great shape with some high-end gear. I couldn't make out too many more features, it was cold and we were both bundled up. We stop and chat. But almost immediately something feels off. Like he's on guard. And as we chat he's really pushing his questions. Where you from? What brought you out here? You with anyone? Normally those questions wouldn't bother me, but whenever I answered incompletely he would push the question. On top of that his answers are always super vague. Name's John. I'm from a couple towns over. I worked nearby. He was really off-putting. The whole time we were talking it was like I could see the gears turning behind his aviators. Like he was thinking just how alone we were. And we were very alone. Our interaction ended when he reached for something on his hip and took a big step towards me. I was scared, he freaked me out, I jumped backwards and almost tripped on my snowshoes. I kept my balance though and had a hand on my gun. Oops, he chuckled, lost my balance there. Well, I have to get going. Stay safe. And he took off. Just started marching in the direction I had just come from. I didn't waste any time either. I started hoofing it. I kept looking over my shoulder every couple of seconds for a few miles. Now at this point I feel like I need to say it's not unusual for backcountry conversations to not really flow. Sometimes they'll hold you up for 20 minutes explaining that the bear scat they saw means there's bears nearby, or that there's a snowdrift a few miles away to look out for, and insist you watch out for it even when you say you're not headed that way. It's also pretty common for backcountry people to be armed. Sometimes animals get desperate, better safe than sorry. So if a backcountry person wanted to hurt you, they're probably more able than most. That said, he's the only guy I've ever met in the backcountry that made me feel unsafe. Was camping alone at a nearby lake. I was in my late teens. I had basically bushwhacked to a remote part of the woods just off the shoreline. I grew up hiking and camping anywhere I could get to, so I was used to the skitters and scuffs. I laid there motionless for hours. I fell asleep for a few hours after the sun was starting to come up. When I woke again, I packed up and crept back out of those woods. Just did not feel right. Haven't felt it since, thankfully. Nothing supernatural or what some would deem creepy, but I didn't sleep for a few days. I've camped and hiked for weeks at a time with and without other people. Was hiking with a group of troublemaker kids because my parents thought my teenage attitude was of the devil. They basically dumped us out in the middle of a state park with a map and a week of trail mix, a soda, candy bar, 5 adults, and 1 full MRE each. Anyway, our first night we set the fire watch schedule, and I was up with a buddy from 3A4A. We get up to relieve the other 2 and they mention they've heard lots of feet running around just beyond the fire. We think nothing of it and start playing some game. All of a sudden, there go the feet. They're running in circles in 100 directions. Finally, we wake up our leader and the other adults. We each turn on our flashlights and realize we're surrounded by a pack of coyotes. They were everywhere. Just circling and getting closer and brave enough to start charging and backing off a little. Next thing we know, this huge, and probably old, his fur looked a little gray, one sits down and starts the yap. Cute kids grabbing the closest adult and bursting into tears. Then a second one joins in. Then a third. Then the entire pack just sits there yapping. It sounded like a distorted scene in a funhouse horror film. That pack followed us the entire week. We hardly slept, and eventually passed out from exhaustion. Our group ended up being the only one ever in the program history to leave with 2 days left. Bonus story, Ann friend and I went camping as a post-high school graduation trip at a local campground. We paid for a spot over by the lake so we could have easy access to swimming. I always have an emergency kit in my camp bag, first aid and sewing kits, compass, granola bars, feminine products, poncho and a flare gun. Well, we go to bed with our backpacks out in the rain fly in an empty cooler with heavy stuff on top. We wake up and she says, "Did you do that? That's not funny." Do what? Exit the tent, and someone had knocked over the cooler, opened my bag, and stuck pads and hung tampons around our campsite. We cleaned up. Packed up. Stopped by the ranger station and noped right out. We both swore the other did it, but I'm a light sleeper, anytime she moved it woke me up. She wanted to go to the bathroom, and we walked together the 50 yards on the lit road to the showers. She refused to camp with me again. But we both agree, we didn't do that. For some context, I've spent a lot of time camping over the years, so I'm not unfamiliar with the woods. I was on a canoe trip with several other people, all of us experienced campers. We were about a day's journey deep in the woods, far from civilization. Around late afternoon, we pulled the canoes ashore and made camp for the night. I went off alone to look for firewood, staying within earshot of camp. Our campsite was between a hill and the shoreline, right at the base of the incline. I decided to check out the top of the hill for curiosity's sake. I got to the top, and the terrain changed. Where the woods surrounding camp consisted of tall, old trees such as white pine and oak, the trees on top of the hill were shorter and scragglier, and the underbrush was thicker. Everything was covered in a layer of moss, and it looked like a dry swamp. There was a clear line where the terrain changed, and I developed a deep sense of unease as I approached it. It wasn't hard to pinpoint the cause. It was dead. Silent. Not a single living thing stirred. Not one bird sang, nor small animal skitter about. Not even the insects made any noise. The otherwise ever-present whine of mosquitoes ceased, and I watched as a lone honeybee crossed that line, did a swift U-turn, and flew back downhill. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I kept looking over my shoulder. It felt as though the shadows, or something in them, was watching me. I've never experienced such a deep feeling of unease in the woods before. It felt wrong, it felt dangerous. It felt as though I was being hunted. I turned around and made my way back to camp as quickly as possible without running. I made an effort to never be alone for the rest of the time we spent at that site. To this day, I don't know what made me feel that way, but I can guess, that area had native wolf, bear, and possibly mountain lion populations. I'm pretty sure I was feeling some large predator stalking me. So, there it is. Not quite a creepy neighbor or violent crime, but an older fear. Something more primal. Went off trail in a local park to get to a stream. It's a fairly isolated area, and it's someplace where you'll hear gunshots frequently because there's a shooting range located nearby. A lot of vagrants hang out there, too, because there are some decent sheltered areas. In the summertime, a lot of local men will just camp out right on the lake and fish and drink beer all night. It's a rough crowd. Overall though, it's a beautiful place, and I've been going there since I was a child, so I was never afraid to be out there and hike the trails by myself. Until one day last fall when I went off trail to get to that stream and saw a bunch of trees that had red spray painted arrows on them. They led further away from the main trail. Whatever, figured it was something the rangers did. Then I saw on one of the largest old trees, in the same red spray paint, the words "dead near" with an arrow pointing toward a clearing. I didn't see anything, but I hightailed it out of there and told the cops about it. I'm sure it was just local racist idiots fucking around. But it was creepy and it made me feel unsafe enough that I don't go out there alone anymore. My two friends and myself were walking up a trail that has a graveyard in it and a public library at the base of the park. The three of us went up there and got near the graveyard. Once we got near it, we noticed two lights going down a zigzag trail which is in front of us. Because we thought it was some park rangers and it was a little late, we didn't want to get in trouble, so we booked it. We got to the bottom and saw that it was only two bikers. I wanted to go back up and continue exploring. One of my friend decided to stay behind because he was tired. So me and my other friend went back up, and near the same spot as before, we saw two lights going down the same path. This time for sure we knew it was rangers, and instead of running, we were going to walk back and explain that we were coming back from a hike. I kept turning around to see if the lights were still there. I didn't see anything behind us, so I was confused. We kept walking and I started to ask, why haven't they passed us yet? There are two ways to get up the mountain. One path is where the graveyard is in, the other path is around is in the other side. The only side path that is where the graveyard is towards a locked gate to a water tank. And that zigzag trail only leads to where the graveyard would be, and we would have seen them. So yeah, seeing the second pair of lights going down and then suddenly disappear made me feel a little uneasy. This place is notable for being haunted. I went here at night because of that and wanted to experience something. I've been to other haunted places before and am planning on going to a haunted dam soon. Had this happened just this last Saturday, 8/19 morning. I was in a group of 5 camping in tent-only campground that had 2 hiking trails you could go on right by the tents. My campsite was one of the few that directly connected to a dirt road that connected the 2 trails. We went up the first one, then came back, and the only thing separating these 2 trails was some bushes and a bush full of berries. We walked past them and went up the other trail, but came back after a snake encounter and someone got scared. While walking back to the campsite, my dad notices the bushes had been walked through by something wide, and a noticeable chunk of berries were gone and a big circle of laid down grass was in front of it. A bear had just recently come through and left during the time we were on the second trail. The rest of the day I was fine, but come night time and me being the only one in my tent and the closest to the trails really had me on edge till about 2 a.m, when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. My dad and I didn't tell them about what we polo shirt, volleys, and a little visor. No pack, no water. Nothing. And we were 35 kilometers from any roads or 4WD tracks. This trail requires hikers to carry everything: food, water, and clothing for the 0 degrees Celsius, 32°F, nights when it often snows. The terrain means that you cannot hike into this particular spot in less than 2 days from any direction, and she clearly wasn't a trail runner. We're talking someone old enough to be a grandma here. We later pored over the maps trying to work out where she'd come from or where she could have gone, and years later, we still don't understand how this tiny lady had found herself in the middle of the Australian wilderness. We later checked with the rangers, who confirmed that nobody had reported her to them. They hadn't had any missing person reports meeting her description in the days following, and they hadn't evacuated anyone that week. We can only assume she survived and that there was something more we couldn't understand, but it still remains the weirdest experience I've ever had on the trail. This happened in Silmar, California. So, my friends, 7 of us all together, grabbed some tents and drove up a nearby mountain. The road ended halfway up, so I parked it on the side and we hiked for what seemed like a few miles. It was getting dark and we were hungry, etc., etc. I'ma just skip to the creepy part. So it was 7 of us split into 3 tents. I was in the bigger one with 2 other people. At about 2:30ish I woke up because I kept hearing someone/something walking around and moving stuff around. I was about to call out and ask if they needed help finding something when I heard a growl. There's a bunch of bunnies, coyotes and raccoons and the occasional stray dog around there, so I didn't want to call out in case there was a hungry coyote out there that would attack if scared. I laid there listening to the sounds when I saw a flash of light. As if someone took a picture and then the sound stopped. I reached over and covered my friend's mouth and shook him awake. I whispered don't talk and did the same with my other friend. I tell them what I heard and they start going on about how it's probably just one of our friends trying to freak us out. We open the tent and get out and our campsite is a mess. Everything is thrown around. And that's when we saw it. There was a flash of light like 40 meters away that lit up this creature-looking thing. Like a person that had been starved. Just pure flesh stretched over bone, but it was covered in a black fuzz. Kind of like the fuzz on a bee. Its face was like a mix between a fly and a human. It had some massive looking insect eyes. It was really dark that night, so after the quick flash, we couldn't see it anymore. We fucking yelled and woke up our other friend and ran to the SUV and locked ourselves in. As I'm driving away, at the end of the road where the SUV was parked there was another flash, and there it was, staring at us driving away. I never went back. This happened about 2 years ago. After a day of trout fishing the local creeks in Tionesta, with my now ex-girlfriend, we stopped just a few miles from my camp on a bridge named Nebraska Bridge. The bridge tends to be a local hotspot for fishing, but it's a rather small bridge and often it's hard to even squeeze my truck past everyone fishing off the bridge come the spring and summer months. It was after dark by the time we stopped there and no one was in sight. The waterway running underneath the bridge is rather wide and thus a large, natural swath is cut through the heavily wooded hillsides on either side of the bridge. It's the perfect place to stargaze. After we both got out of the truck, I lit a cigarette and began counting the shooting stars. It was a beautiful night and the sky was pitch black save for the millions of little twinkles overhead. One by one we counted aloud as the stars shot off before disappearing into the void. My ex stood on one side of the bridge counting as I stood on the other. It was so dark I could barely even make out her figure in the abyss. The cherry on my cigarette illuminated my face and sidewalls of the bridge with each drag, the darkness amplifying its weak glow to an almost candle-like strength. The cricket's rhythmic tune seemed almost deafening on such a still night. "Whoa, there's another one," my ex whispered as I turned to see the faint trail of another star fading from sight. I hummed an acknowledgement as I took in the magnificence. My comfortable feeling quickly dispersed as I heard the first whistle. The whistle carried an almost sort of tune, not the tune of a song, or rhyme necessarily, also not the kind used to get someone's attention, just a soft whistle that carried and dipped a bit. My ex quickly walked over to my side and asked if I had heard it. I whispered back that I hadn't and be quiet a second. The whistle came from my side of the bridge on the hillside farthest away. Again we heard the whistle. I assumed someone must be fishing farther down the creek along the bank, but it seemed too far up the hillside for that to be the case. The eerie feeling crept in the second I realized that the cricket's night noises had vanished. It seemed as though they too had quieted down to hear the whistle. My ex stood closer now and whispered, "I have a nervous feeling, like a bad feeling." I didn't want to scare her by confirming that I too didn't feel right anymore and the hair on my arms were now standing at attention. I just told her that I was armed and it was just a whistle. The night was too beautiful to be scared away by a spooky whistle. Every few seconds the whistle rose and dipped, carrying through the ravine. Same location every time, same tone and same hillside. I lit another cigarette just as the whistle sounded again, this time on the complete opposite side of the creek, a different hillside entirely. It was the same tone, and as far as my ear could tell it was the same person, but the possibility of it being the same person would mean someone would have to run through the woods, cross the creek and climb to a rather high elevation to be where the whistle now was, all in a matter of seconds and without making any noise to do so. That was enough for me as I took her hand and led her to the truck. Hearing the locks engage as we closed the doors was an amazing comfort. I started the truck up and pulled off. My ex broke the silence. "I felt like we were being watched the whole time." "I believe we were," I replied. I love taking walks at night. I've done it pretty regularly since I was a teenager. Back when my ex and I were together we would go out almost every night to talk and wander down unpaved and ill-lit back roads for hours. I've seen some shit over the years. There was one time when the two of us were walking down through a wooded valley, a path we'd followed many times before. As we drew close to the path leading down through the woods, though, I started to get a very iffy feeling about it. I slowed down uncertainly, as my ex kept walking down toward the tunnel of trees and shadow. "Ah," I said finally, stopping at the edge of the darkness. Further in, he turned around to look back at me, still strolling backward, out of the range of the orange streetlight at my back. "I don't think we should go this way," I said finally, feeling a bit silly but unable to go on. There was a distinctly wild, creepy feeling coming from that darkness, and a scant moment after I'd said the words there came this deep, distinct and barrel-chested growling from the trees, some very large animal in there, something huge and canid. It was directed right at us, a firm rumbling snarl that sounded too big to be a domestic dog. My ex stopped, turned around, we searched the shadow at the edge of the woods but there was nothing visible there, whatever had growled was far enough in not to be seen. He turned back and started walking back up toward the streetlights where I stood. The growl didn't come again, but when he reached me his face was paper white and he affirmed that he had heard it too. On that same path, we passed a guy once who was just standing there in the dark, and when we walked past him he suddenly took a Polaroid photograph of us and walked blithely away. We looked at each other with some mutual intimation of confronting the guy, but the situation was so bizarre that there didn't seem to be much to do with it other than to shrug and walk away. It's like Tommyknocker Town out here sometimes. Did a fair share of wild camping when I lived in the UK. Me and my buddy would sleep tentless with bevy bags over the sleeping bag to protect from the elements. While this was amazing in general, it would have mixed results. One hot summer night in Epping Forest, I could feel spiders, bugs and various creepy crawlies all over my face and barely got any sleep. Tubing back the next day, we both had faces like UFC fighters from all the bites. In Buckinghamshire, in a forest near the home path between thick fern, and saw a baby boar way ahead. Coming closer tensely, a massive adult boat crossed the path at great speed where the baby was, and we both freaked out and started running. Laughing at our foolishness after, my buddy dropped his iPhone and smashed the screen. We continued our hike with a new respect for the forest inhabitants and later set up camp deep in the woods. We were sleeping on a hillock under deep wooded cover, and in the middle of the night I was awoken by my friend, who informed me we were surrounded by boar. Groggy as hell, I could hear commotion and snorting of the animals from all sides. My vision cleared and we could see them too, even in the near total darkness. It was actually just a large group of them passing the bottom of the hillock, but we believed we were surrounded out of fear and naivety. We stood up on a log, standing in our sleeping bags, as if this would do anything, and one of the boar came sniffling close along the ground. Satisfied that it was just stupid humans or else something they couldn't eat, he bounded off and rejoined the collective. There were between 10 and 15 of them and a load of piglets following. We settled down once again, laughed at our behavior and went back to sleep unharmed. At the time it was extremely exhilarating, but in retrospect, a fond memory and learning experience. The next day, driving out of the forest, we could see them to the sides in the thick woods, and once again admired the size of the beasts. From a trip a couple months ago. Trip report: so it turned into one of the more interesting but strange hikes I've been on in about 15 years of hiking. So me and the old lady head out to the trailhead on Wednesday, and upon arrival at the trailhead saw two busted up cars. Like really busted, every piece of glass broke and one had a large rock embedded in the windshield. Kinda made us a little uneasy going in, but nothing super out of the norm on out of the way trailheads. So we set out on the hike. The New River Canyon is beautiful, although heavily stocked with poison oak. But about 2 or so miles in, we come to a memorial on the side of the trail with all sorts of little trinkets and some of those fake fabric flowers, a distinct blue amongst a sea of green. Again, didn't think too much of this, but as we are leaving, my GF said something about the rocks being stacked like a grave. I thought she was talking about the memorial itself and didn't totally agree. So at this point I can tell the old lady is pretty uneasy at the start to our hike, but to tell the truth I was most uneasy about that dang poison oak all over. So as we are coming up to the junction of Virgin Creek, we notice a nice flat clearing and I went down to explore. Down there were a few trails that lead down to the river. The center one lead to what looked like a active mining claim. There we found another memorial. This time it was a large stone headstone looking cross with those same blue flowers. There was also a tent covered with a tarp, but there was these odd bone slash with wind chimes. We peeked out on the bank of the river. There was a stretch of about 300 yards or so where there were large rocks stacked in odd formations. Some were about the size of a person's torso stacked up like small snowmen, others like indicate cairns, others in odd circles. For some reason this was the most unsettling about the site. I wish I could do more justice to the hair-raising feeling I got while being in that campsite. So knowing if I felt at all uneasy, my poor GF was definitely not going to want to stay the night, we decided on a day hike and boogied on back to the truck. On the way back I came across a large rock pile off the downhill side of the trail and said, "Hey, this looks like it might be where someone's buried," to which my GF pushed me along as I glanced at the memorial there on the right. All in all, it was a pretty odd experience. Just kind of got an off vibe out there ever since the broke into cars, and since we didn't bring the dog we felt a little more vulnerable than usual. Every year, my stepdad's family has a family reunion camping trip up in Northern California. My mom married him when I was 22, and I'm only 27 now, so I have only been to a few of them. I moved to Chicago 2 years ago, so I have missed out on the last couple reunions. The first one I went to right after their marriage. My little brother, mom, and stepdad threw all our camping gear into his truck and decided to make a road trip out of it, heading from Southern California to the campgrounds up north. It was about a 13-hour drive. When we first stopped for gas just outside of Los Angeles, still about 11 hours from our destination, a very creepy guy who was pumping gas next to us looked at our gear in the back of the pickup and said, "You ought not disturb nature this weekend. It won't be kind to you. The woods don't want you out there." We ignored him, finished pumping gas and left. We hit a rest stop several hours later. It was basically a preserve that was also a truck stop. It had a little informational wall that told us about local wildlife. We all went to the bathroom and my little brother and I came out to read about the animals in the area. When we walked around to the other side, where it gave info about the plants, we noticed a piece of paper folded and taped to very middle. I unfolded it, and it read "Leave nature alone. You've already been warned." Immediately my brother and I are creeped out. First the guy at the gas station. Now, hundreds of miles north, we find a note that seems directed at us. Of course, my mom and stepdad don't seem too bothered by it, so we pressed on and eventually arrived at the campgrounds. We all hop out of the car and stretch our stiff and cramped legs. We go and pick out the plot of land we intend to camp on and set up our tents. I set mine up a little further into the trees than the rest of them. My brother stayed closer to the fire pits and the trail. The campground even had cabins, but I didn't want glamorous camping. I wanted it to be as rugged as it could be for being on a campground like this. Then we go to meet and greet the rest of the family. It was my first time meeting the extended family of my new stepdad, and I got along with them all quite nicely. My new cousins were really great people. They were a very welcoming family. After some activities for the day, we head back to the tents, and my mom and stepdad's tent has been deconstructed and has a dead woodpecker sitting right in front of it. My little brother's tent is still perfectly constructed, but it was then sitting in the back of the pickup truck. My tent was moved into the middle of a clearing that the campground used as an archery range. We all have a mutual WTF moment, and we all get to work on putting our tents back. At this point, I moved my tent closer to my family's tents. After we finish up, we get in our tents and get to sleep. That night, we all heard footsteps outside our tents. Normally we would assume it was the people who own the campgrounds, doing a walkthrough to make sure everyone had put their campfires out before going to bed. But these footsteps were running back and forth. When my stepdad or I would poke our heads out of our tents to see, nothing was there. Nobody really slept that night. The next morning we discussed our experience with the grounds owners and the rest of the family, and they all said they didn't know anything. We assumed maybe one of the younger kids was bored and playing a prank. But it didn't add up, given that we saw nobody out there and it just wasn't possible for anyone to hide that quickly. The second night, after we all went to our tents to sleep, we had an easier time. No footsteps. But I did hear my little brother reading out loud, which was weird. He didn't bring a book with him, so I had no idea what he could be reading. I assumed maybe he was borrowing one of the books I brought, but when I checked my bag, both the books I brought were still there. So I listened more closely, and he was reciting perfectly the stuff we had read on that informational wall back at the rest stop. When I woke up the next morning, my brother was already awake and he immediately asked me, "Did you hear Mom reading last night?" I was a little stunned, but replied, No. I heard you reading or reciting the stuff from the wall at the rest stop." He looked puzzled, and explained that's what he thought he heard our mom reading. "I heard your voice," I stated. And he replied it was Mom. I could tell he wasn't lying. He smiles when he tries to prank people. He's notoriously bad at keeping a straight face, so I believed him. We heard the same thing at the same time, but he heard our mom's voice, and I heard his. When we went to talk to my mom about it, she wasn't in her tent. But there was another breakfast, say our goodbyes, and then head home. We pulled in, and parked at the rec room, ate, had some conversations, and then decided it was time to go. But when we got outside, everything we had packed in the truck was missing. We found it all set up, back at the spot we had been camping when we first arrived. Where all the creepy shit was happening. The rec room walls were almost completely made of floor-to-ceiling windows, and our truck was parked right in front. We had a perfect view of it, and we saw nobody touching our stuff. And nobody else seemed to have seen anything either. It somehow just appeared at our old camping spot. This time, we opened the tents, and each of us had a dead woodpecker inside, and notes that said safe travels. The following year, everyone decided to have the reunion at a different campground, breaking a tradition of having it at the same grounds they've had it at for 25 plus years before that. It wasn't just my mom, stepdad, brother, and I that were shaken by this. Even though we seemed to be the only ones being targeted, it inspired the whole family to find a new place for the reunions after that. Everyone was scared. The 2 reunions I went to the following year, at a new campground, were fine. Nothing creepy.